Welcome to Humanity in Deep Space. This is episode 18, Mars 1. The first mission to Mars will face a hard set of problems and unprecedented challenges, many of which can't be adequately understood until an actual mission is undertaken. These issues include strict weight and mass restrictions, health and medicine, extended deep space radiation exposure, isolation, boredom, and the availability of appealing and healthy food. Our diverse panel will discuss these varied issues, including ideas about how we might prepare and confront them. Our panelists are Mike Canga. Retired from NASA, Mike was former manager of the Exploration Medical Capabilities element of the Human Research Program, studying deep space missions. Michelle Lucas is an engineer and the founder and president of Higher Orbits. Michelle was formerly a flight controller for the International Space Station and an astronaut technical instructor at NASA's Johnson Space Center. Shahreen Reza is the co-founder and CEO of Astrius, creating IA-powered personalized formulations to elevate cognitive and physical performance of astronauts, delivered in the form of indulgent chocolate truffles. Tiffany Vora is a biologist, entrepreneur, futurist, writer, and vice president of innovation partnerships at Explore Mars. Tiffany has extensive Mars analog mission experience. Our moderator is Chris Kimmel, founder of Humanity in Deep Space and co-founder of the commercial space company Space Tango.
Hello, this is Chris Kimmel with Humanity in Deep Space. I want to welcome everybody to this webcast, a really particularly interesting one, I think, looking at some of the really difficult issues and challenges facing us on the initial mission to Mars. When we talk about Mars, we talk a lot about underground living and growing food and energy and things like that. But of course, some of the biggest challenges we're going to face are in those initial missions before we've had time to simulate a lot of things. We've had really a lot of time to answer a lot of the very hard and difficult questions about humans being successful at being able to do this. So we've got a great panel, very diverse panel that are experienced in a lot of different areas that can help us deal with this. All of you who have been here before know you feel free to ask questions on the curated chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So after we've been going 5 minutes or so, please feel free to do that. This is pretty informal, so we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. Let me start off by thanking the sponsors of Humanity in Deep Space that make all of this possible. We've got Space 629, Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, the National Stem Cell Foundation, the Serving Institute at NASA Ames, Children's Center, Baird, Space Tango, Media Collaboratory, the START program at the University of Kentucky, 22 Solutions, Visit Lex, the Interstellar Foundation, and Higher Orbits. Again, thank all of you for your ongoing support of this endeavor. I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves very briefly. So let me start with Michelle.
Hi, Michelle Lucas. I am the founder and CEO of Higher Orbit. So I work with our next generation of STEMists and explorers to inspire them through the use of space. But my background is a technical one. I spent more than a decade at NASA's Johnson Space Center working in the Mission Operations Division as a flight controller and working to train astronauts to fly to the International Space Station. Spent time at our international partners and working our underwater analog missions. Super excited to have this conversation today. Long-time listener, first-time caller, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Michelle. Mike?
I'm Mike Canga. I'm retired from Johnson Space Center. I was with this agency for a little over 35 years. The last 10 years, I worked in the Human Research Program, which was chartered really to look at all of the issues surrounding deep space flight and long-duration missions. And prior to that, I was the program risk manager for the Space Shuttle Program.
And Mike, I know you just mentioned, you kind of alluded, you've some of your experiences in deep space human missions.
Yeah, so I mean, the Human Research Program really was about looking at what it's going to take for 3 and 5 year and extended term presence in space. While I was there, I spent some time working with the food and environmental systems, and then medical system design, and finally working up at the program office, looking at pretty much across the entire program what the science portfolio looked like.
Yeah, thanks. Tiffany.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Bora. I am currently the Vice President of Innovation Partnerships at Explore Mars. I'm a molecular biologist by training, but I am interested in all the technologies that are not only going to make life in space better, but also make life on Earth better. I'm also very privileged to be an advisor to Astrius, which Shireen is going to tell you about in a minute. It's a very exciting company. I've also been lucky enough to do 3 analog Mars missions in the southeastern Utah desert and in the high Canadian Arctic. And as some of you may know, I recently got back from Antarctica. So I have some experience in isolated environments as well with small groups of people.
Thanks, Tiffany. Shireen.
Hi, I'm Shireen Reza. I'm the CEO and founder of Astrius. We've looked at how to ensure that astronauts can truly thrive in space. So our first product was a high-performance chocolate truffle that elevates cognition, focus, as well as physical endurance. I previously come from Palantir Technologies, and now we're introducing way to actually have AI-powered personalized nutrition in order that all of the formulations can actually be curated and optimized towards individual astronauts and high performers. I love having a phenomenal team, and I'm really excited to be here today. For us, it was not just looking at the culinary element, but also what it means to be an astronaut. So my COO, Scott Parazinski, who Michelle, you might know, was a former astronaut, an Olympian, and a doctor. And for us, the idea is, yes, you create high performance to those who are really pushing at the maximum, and then you have it accessible for all of us here on Earth.
Thank you all. So as we jump in, let me set a little bit the context here, and the context just for the purpose of discussion. I think as most of us would agree, the consensus is an initial human trip to Mars is probably 2.5 to 3 years. I'll leave open whether we actually circumnavigate and come back or people land. I think that's open. But I think that's one of the big questions. So a lot of the things we talk about in terms of food, energy, oxygen, all these kinds of things, we have to think in that context. And of course, we really don't have any parallels, any precedents for humans spending that kind of time in deep space in these kind of environments. So to start off, I'd just like to ask each one of you, when you think about the first trip to Mars, human mission to Mars, and you think about the challenges and problems, what are the 1 or 2 things that first jump to your mind? Not necessarily the most important, because I think they're all important, but what jumps to your mind? Let me start off with Tiffany.
People, and people. That's what comes to mind for me. And I would love to hear Michelle's feedback on this. I was recently speaking with the NASA chief technologist, and I brought this up as an area that I was interested in. And he said, oh, we can select and train for that. And I thought, that's a pretty confident statement. And so, Michelle, I would love for you to unmute and tell me what you think.
All right, Michelle.
So Tiffany, I definitely have a thought on this, and I'm with you. It's people is the first piece of it. And yes, we can train. I think the element that is thought of less than it probably should be, and my NASA counterparts are going to be very unhappy for me making this comment, but we don't always do the most awesome job of pairing crew members who are actually compatible. The attitude becomes that you are a professional and you should be able to work through anything. And that may be true for a 2-week mission. That may even be true for a 3 to 6 month mission. To me, that's actually not viable for a multi-year mission. We have to pay a better bit of attention to who works well together. Sending them on a Knowles trip is lovely. An analog mission is lovely. It becomes a very different beast when you're in a spacecraft that is not able to come home for 2.5 to 3 years. And so I think the people element is a piece that I hate to say is the dirty little secret nobody's talking about, but that's a piece of it, is we have to start paying better attention to what are the right personalities and how do those personalities go well together.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that is when it comes to interpersonal relationships and bonding over people over long periods of time, for me, that's about food. Not just food in terms of nutritionally and functionally, what will this do for you as an individual? But when we started the company, we interviewed so many astronauts. And what came back to us was it was really the mealtime that was that point of camaraderie and breaking through tension. But then if you take it one step further, being out there in space for 3 years is such a long time. What are you eating? Also really helps bond, because if you have this joyous desire to sit down together and break bread, I feel like that helps build those human relationships versus the contrary.
Right. And I'll pile on to that a little bit, because that was a big discussion. It still is, I know. Communal meal times, the cultural norms of food, and that I think is probably one of the issues that's not been discussed really heavily, is the actual cultural differences in food when you get a multicultural crew. So the expectations of what you're going to eat as staples and what you eat as celebratory foods, if you're from Central Europe, is significantly different than the Midwest, and India or any Southeast Asia will have a far different palate. So it's a difficult problem to crack, for sure.
Well, and to the point of food, sorry, Chris, if I may hop in there just one more time. So there's the what do you eat, how do you eat it together, and then there's a fresh element. So Steve Swanson, astronaut, he was the first to get to harvest lettuce from the veggie experiment on board the International Space Station. And every time I have a salad, I literally think about him and feel bad, because he had to harvest the first head of lettuce and he couldn't eat it because the Brown wanted to study it first to make sure that it was okay. And I can just imagine, knowing Steve like I do, lettuce, like salad is his thing. And so there's the eating something good, but there's also that freshness element. There's a piece of that we have grown to crave as humans, that we see astronauts missing after a handful of months. So 2.5 to 3 years, growing plants have to be a piece of that puzzle with food.
I want to circle back and start. I'm going to break this down a little bit. And we've touched on a lot of things and break this down specifically. And when I think of these, humans to Mars and these first trips, I often come back to something that H.L. Mencken, the journalist, once said, for every complex hard problem, there's a clear answer that's wrong. And so I know this, we're not looking for the answer, because we probably don't have them. But let me circle back and start with one of the key, Ash, and that's the health and physiology of humans. I mean, we don't have any experience of that kind of long-term exposure to zero G, radiation, all those kinds of things. And so, and I know we've all seen some early evidence of certain kinds of physiological issues, even with neurons happening after short stays in space. So I just would like to, just throw out there, how are we going to deal with, how do we approach this problem of not knowing and not being able to simulate, and yet saying, okay, we're ready to send you out for 3 years?
So
go ahead, Mike.
I'll just kind of give you some history within the human research program. And I think everybody's familiar with the 1-year extended duration missions on station. The thinking behind that was that if you look at whatever biomarker that you're interested in, I'm going to loosely call it a decay history. So you can see the change over time. And the idea was to see if we could actually have enough extended information to extrapolate, and I use that term very carefully, as every engineer knows, but to see whether the degradation is accelerating, decreasing, asymptotic, and determine whether we feel like we need to incrementally approach longer duration missions, or whether we think we understand how whatever the thing we're measuring is behaving, and whether it would be predictable. So there's been some thought and work done on that, because you may not necessarily have to have a full 3-year mission to reduce the risk enough to feel comfortable in committing to such a mission?
I'm going to pull harder on that to be a bit provocative as well. So I think I like what Mike said about reducing risks to the point that you're comfortable. Then the question becomes to whose comfort level, right? I am not one of these people that believes we have to wait until we know everything. If we do that, we will never do anything ever again. I mean, the fact of the matter is the human body evolved for life on Earth, period. And so I think it's a completely unreasonable expectation that we can, if we wait long enough, we'll get to the point where the human body will be just fine in space. That's just not what we evolved to do over millions of years. So what is the point where we are not unnecessarily exposing people to lifetime risk? And I also want to remember that our astronauts and our travelers are informed, right? They're giving consent to participate in such a thing. This is not experimenting on people who haven't given consent. So I love Mike's point about finding that balance. For me, a lot of these pieces come in, I'm a child of an immigrant who came to the United States with the money he had in his pocket and 2 friends, and dad figured it out, right? We have a human history of figuring it out to the best as we can. Is there collateral damage? Absolutely. But historically, that is how humans as a species have evolved and moved to the next journeys of next steps in our journey. So that's my don't wait forever stump. Do the best you can, be a scientist, be observing, share the data, have as many eyes as the problem on the problem as possible. But don't wait to know everything, because we're never going to know everything.
Okay.
So to that point, I'm going to hop in there and say, as I will defer to all of you as the brilliant scientist, and I'm going to go to the boring side of this. You're absolutely right. These are people who do this under informed knowledge. However, we still have governmental regulations that preclude a variety of things. For example, when you start talking about the first almost 1-year mission for Scott Kelly, there was another astronaut who was very interested in doing it, but was not able to do so because this person would break the OSHA requirements of a lifetime of radiation. And so to get to the boring elements away from the science elements, there has to be some governmental regulation changes as well. If I, as a human, decide I am willing to take the risk to go to Mars as even a NASA career astronaut, then I should be allowed to make that choice. The government shouldn't be allowed to say, no, by OSHA regulations, you exceed your radiation limit. So we're going to have to not only push the boundaries of science, we also start having to push the boundaries of regulations that are coming from our government.
I had 2 questions, Michelle. First off, what are your thoughts on commercial space flight and almost looking at that avenue where suddenly the government isn't always in charge? It is a society where individuals can suddenly make these independent decisions.
So I'm a huge fan, and I think all individuals should have the right to make these choices, provided they are not causing harm to others. And so when we start to get into regulations, I do believe in the FAA regulating to make sure we're not dropping spent boosters on, homes and whatnot. But any human who wants to sign up to go to the moon, Mars, etc., should be allowed to do these things. And I think commercial companies are the place that these things can and should happen, because NASA should be paving the way for exploration, and commercial space should be picking up that mantle and continuing to expand the reach to other humans. That's exactly what's happening right now. If you look at SpaceX's incredible successes, both with commercial crew in partnership with NASA and outside of NASA with companies like Axiom or partners like Axiom Space, I think we're seeing that transition, and I hope it just continues to grow more and more.
I'm so glad the conversation went in this direction this quickly, because that was an issue that I wanted to raise, Chris, about the subject of this conversation. What is the first manned mission to Mars? What are the challenges? My first question when I read your email was, well, is it a commercial, or is it a private or a public mission? Because as I think a lot about analogies with the Antarctic exploration, right? Think about the famous Amundsen and Scott race to the South Pole, right? Amundsen was down there with a small team. They had dogs and skis. They were moving as fast as possible. They weren't doing a whole lot of science on the way. They all made it home. Scott had this huge British-backed expedition. They were doing science. They had military involvement. It was massive, years and years of prep. He didn't make it back. So I'm really interested by this tension in what does that first mission look like? Is it the big NASA machine, or is it something light and lean, something more commercial?
Let me ask a question, playing devil's advocate. And again, not being a scientist, I can ask really uninformed questions and not fear that people will say, well, that guy's an idiot. Since we don't know, and again, even a year on station is different than a year in deep space. There's a lot of issues there. I look back at the beginning of the space program, and we had, Mercury, Gemini, and then Apollo. I mean, is there any thought or feasibility of thinking, okay, well, maybe like that, we do this a little bit in gradation, and we send a crew out in deep space for 3 months and turn around and have them come back and see what happened, as opposed to like, okay, let's just put everybody up for 3 years. And again, that may not be realistically, technologically, or what else. But I'm just, wondering, as opposed to just saying, well, the first time's going to be the big one.
So
we don't know.
That becomes an orbital mechanics issue. It's hard to send a capsule up into a just random point and bring it back. We oftentimes, and so for example, with a Mars mission, we're using some slingshot energy from that. So it does become a difficult engineering challenge to be able to just send a capsule up for a handful of months, to a random point in deeper space than we're used to going to. And but I don't know. I will defer to the scientists from the science side of that.
Well, but in the constellation mission planning, there were some concepts for doing deep space HABs and circumlunar missions that would be as good of a mimic as you could get to a deep space without committing to the full Mars mission. I mean, one of the larger issues with the Mars mission is there is no abort case, right? It's the same as the Apollo 13. You've got 144 hours home minimum, but with Mars, it's 9 months home minimum, and that's if you happen to be in the right place to take the short way home. So there is a question about, you could do deep space missions, but then it goes back to the risk and the ethics questions again, because you're taking a substantial set of risk versus whatever the benefit of the mission is. So if the benefit of the mission and the culture can buy into having the real purpose of the mission is to refine operations to understand risk, rather than the science-heavy purposes that we've had in prior NASA missions. Well, most space missions could be done, but that again becomes a societal question.
Let me ask one more question before we go ahead, Shreen. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no. I would almost say, if we were to do it as a two-tranche process, first look at the moon. I mean, hopefully Artemis is successful, and 2026 will be over 50 years since either woman or man will have stepped foot. And I would almost say, if we could successfully build out a lunar colony or some way of living there for longer periods of time, bringing the humanity back into space and saying, okay, well, we know what the risks are, what are interventions we could use, whether it's nutritional countermeasures, whether it's music, and having that component of humanity to enable us to have better interpersonal relationships. After conquering that, then let's go to Mars. I certainly hope that we get to go to Mars in our lifetime. But instead of being like, okay, let's just look at Mars, why not take that two-step approach and learn from our findings?
Let me just also let me transition just a little bit, because we could spend the whole time talking about this. What about the health side? All right, so you've got 3 years. One of the huge constraints and hurdles for any kind of mission to deep space or even to the moon is weight and mass. I mean, you can only take so much. And so when we talk about health, we talk about a crew of 4 to 6 people, 3 years or something. The one question I've thought about, and I've actually talked to some NASA flight surgeons about this, and there's no easy answer. What's the minimum amount of medical equipment that you should take? The minimum, because you can't, but somebody may get sick and something may happen. And we also know the problem being that when you get into deep space, there's a 25-minute communication lag. So you're not going to be, talking to somebody in real time. So what about, how do we think about those kinds of things? This is the issue of in-flight health over 3 years.
So, and that's, I spent 3 years of my career with this, and there's a fantastic group looking at it. You really have to understand human health. The approach we were taking was to try and build some probabilistic models of what we need to worry about. So the problem with designing health systems, in my experience with doctors, is that they bring their experience to the board, which you love. But if I get an emergency medicine doctor in the same room as a cardiologist, what I need in the health kit changes significantly. So go ahead.
Sorry, I will add one thing to this, which I find interesting. When we talk about human health, I'll pair it with a comment that Reg had actually pointed out in terms of government crises. And I know that when we had the space race, it was, I would say, race we had with the Soviet Union. But now that China is a part of this race, when I look at health and performance, it's not just medicine, but also physical performance. So looking at the politics of where the Olympic medal count is, in the end, China ended up with 40 gold medals, as did America. And I think if there's anything that will propel us to go to Mars, it will be a competition, I hope, a friendly one, but with China. And I say this because there's so much we can learn if we actually share knowledge. And we did that with the Soviets. And I feel like when it comes to human health, instead of counting them as adversaries, should we be able to take a step back and just share knowledge that way? I think we would advance much further as humanity, because even now, politically, sure, we're at heads with Russia, but we're still collaborating with the cosmonauts. So on my end, I almost feel as though human health should be taken as not one where we are politically at counterparts, but holistically.
Yeah, one of the questions that came in was from a listener who indicated that talking about the Apollo, and that it took competition in a crisis really to lead this country to reach those kinds of heights. And the question of, are we going to be able to do that? Absent that, Tiffany.
Yeah, I just want to go back to this health question, because I want to hit it with the innovation stick, since that's what I see things happening. Another important thing to remember here is that we have the capacity to skate to the puck in a really big way. We are not required to make decisions about 2033 or 2043 or 2053 based on today's technologies. So, for example, there was a question in the chat about who's going to do the dentistry. There was news just a few months ago about the first fully autonomous robotic dental surgery that replaced a crown in one session in a very, very short amount of time. So when I think about what is healthcare going to look like on these future missions, it's going to be humans, the humans on the crew, and robots and AI working together in real time to work with what comes up. Now, I don't know that this will be the case on the first mission, but looking deeper, I would also think about combinatorial efforts. I'm a biologist. I think a lot about synthetic biology. Lynn Rothschild at NASA Ames has this idea for an astropharmacy, where instead of bringing every medication that you have, you bring the biological components to manufacture what you need when you need it on demand, using a biological system for that, for precision fermentation or something similar. Go ahead, Mike.
And I'll tack on to that. We were looking, and 3D printing, you don't have to bring every piece of equipment. There's a note about the dentistry, very specific hardware you can actually make on the fly. Technology is going to be a huge part of it. But the other thing we were beginning to address, and this is just ripe for a lot of work, is looking at holistic medicine. So usually when you talk about medicine in space, people will talk about surgery. They'll talk about a lot of these emergent medical cases. but what you really want to do is you want a high performing crew when you get to whatever they need to perform at. So including the diet, including the environmental systems, and trying to improve the overall health of the crew actually probably will be a much more significant driver to the medical system, or the lack of the mass of the required medical system, than just trying to understand what you might need for a few emergency cases.
Yeah, well, and one of the questions was too, isn't the whole idea behind the moon missions too to build up exposure to long-term space? And I think there is, but again, there's still some differences between going to a place that's 3 days away and staying for several weeks or a month.
And so I just wanted to, because I saw the question, I just want to throw this. It's not related to this conversation, but one of the more interesting things about a lunar mission is we don't know what crew performance is going to look like when you come from a 9-month microgravity mission to a reduced gravity environment. We know what it looks like when you come back to Earth, and it's sometimes a very difficult transition. But the moon is about the only analog we will have for going from. And so, and that's a super important question, because the other question is when people talk about perhaps providing some kind of artificial gravity concept, do you have to give them 1G or do a much lower G component, which would make it a less significant engineering challenge?
Mike, you had touched base on something, and I know Auxilia Miranda asked about it. I love that you correlated the holistic health and also mentioned the surgery. So one of the neurosurgeons we're actually working with, his name's Dr. Vitor Pereira. He has performed one of the first AI-driven remote robotic brain surgeries. To me, that sounded insane, but they're working on it right now. And one of the questions Miranda has is, would the 20-minute communication lag be an issue? I'm sure there would be issues, but the fact that that work is happening currently and people are hyper aware of the relevance is interesting, because that means that technology is just a heartbeat away. That being said, taking a step back, with Astrius, we did look at what impact whole foods could do, nootropics, adaptogens, things like lion's mane mushroom. And I think it's pairing the two and understanding human performance, how you can actually approach it organically, looking at things like sleep, exercise, healthy eating patterns, but then also in terms of medical intervention, what technologically is feasible when you're so far out there in remote locations.
Right. And I think, I mean, the original question Chris asked about what the big challenges were, I think one of the hugest challenges, if this were a government mission, is learning more autonomous mission management, a more autonomous mission management philosophy, which you're going to have to do, especially in medical cases with a 20-minute delay.
And what do you mean by that, Mike?
Michelle, I see you nodding.
Michelle.
This one.
Well, right now we're somewhat spoiled, right? We have a very low lag time, and so we train the crew to be operators in a wide variety of things, experts in a few things, with the knowledge that we can get them information very quickly if they need it while they're on the International Space Station or even on the moon. Going to Mars becomes a whole different beast, right? And it's not just the expected lag, it's the holy cow, something happened and we are, this far away with zero communication for days on end because of a dust storm or anything like that. And so there has to be a shift that happens in the training in general. It's a problem we had when we shifted from space shuttle training to space station training. At first, our training template for a space station crew was 3 years, which was crazy because we wanted them to be an expert in everything. And then we realized, wait, maybe this isn't the best idea. Let's give them different levels because we know that we can help support them. Now it has to go back to, they do need to know more, but as mentioned, all these technologies make it so they may have to know more in certain areas, but they're going to have the assistive opportunities with AI or things of that nature to help them. It's going to be less space to ground communication and more of happening autonomously if it's whether it's a NASA mission or a commercial mission. But I also want to bring up one thing that is not a pretty topic. It ties into everything we just talked about, and it goes back to Chris's initial question of what are the biggest challenges. Because while I agree with Tiffany, it's people, people, people. My next one, my third people is people in a different capacity. It's cultural will. If we look at this, especially from a governmental perspective, and we look at the tragedies that we have had happen in the space industry and what happens when a tragedy happens and we shut down. The reality is, and Tiffany, I love that you use the Antarctic analogy because I use it all the time. In exploration, people die. And people don't want to talk about that, but they do. And the reality is that if they're on the space station, we can get them home pretty quickly. The moon, we can still get them home fairly quickly in the grand scheme of the world. Mars, they're not coming back. And so we have to also start to fully address, I mean, it has been addressed of what happens if this happened in space. Thankfully, it has not. But what happens when it happens on the way to Mars or on Mars? And then what happens to the cultural will? There's a great Nat Geo series from, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago about, it's this great hybrid. They're talking about the things that are happening in space, but there's also this fictional narrative of the first people to go colonize Mars. And when somebody dies, it becomes, everyone's like, we're out, forget it. You know, we're pulling our support. And to me, that does become one of the challenges, is when this inevitable happens, which we would like to prevent from happening, but inevitably deep space exploration is going to happen. What happens to the cultural will to continue to do that, and the government will?
And that's a great question. I will say, you know, I started in January of 1986 at Johnson. And on the last week of January, we were pretty sure none of us had jobs. But the response was 180 degrees out from that. There was a recommitment. So I just bring that up simply to say that it's not obvious what the outcome's going to be. But it's a conversation that needs to happen early on as to, you know, the Antarctic exploration, actually any of the extreme explorations are great examples. And I looked at those a lot when I was working with the Human Research Program. So there's Scott and Adamson, and there's a lot of a superb set of parallels there. There also was an Australian expedition that went down there, and I love this expedition because one of the crews out on a pair of dog sleds got injured. They managed to get back to the base camp and got to watch the ship sail away. So they had a small overwintering contingent. They had a guy who barely made it back and ended up having to spend the winter back on the ice until they could get back to rescue them again. And they had a guy go psychotic during that winter. And I'll try and find the name of the mission. There's a great book on it. Nobody remembers that. There's another supreme failure of Arctic exploration where the leader left, got on a dog sled, and came back to Alaska and said the entire expedition was lost, and then they were recovered 2 years later. And there are great analogs available out there to look at. I'm doing my old man tangent, but anyway,
actually,
go on.
Shireen, I just want to pull one thread out of all this because I think it's really important. Exploration is hard, right? The idea that our astronauts are going to go up there and they're going to feel great every minute of the day and no one's ever going to get hurt and no one's ever going to get crabby and no one's ever going to get sick, that is nonsense, right? As it is, our astronauts are under extreme physical and mental stress, right? And we haven't backed away from that. And I just want to point out, when we talk about Mars, I'm a big Mars person. If Elon call me, I'll go tomorrow. I'm ready. It's not going to be that much fun. It's going to be hard. Michelle, back me up here. Like, this is hard work.
It's totally
sucks, right?
And it does. I mean, and that's just it, right? It takes a different mentality to want to do these missions, whether it is 6 months in space or, a 3-year trip to Mars. And I think there's an element of the people who are the first to stand up and say, I want to go. In many ways, those are the people we want to go because they know themselves. I'm going to be honest. When I have conversations with students or adults, I do a little thing where I have everybody stand up who would fly to space tomorrow for a quick up and back. And then I have everybody sit down who doesn't want to fly a long duration mission to the space station. I have everybody stay standing who wants to go to the moon. And like we start to see decreasing numbers of people, right? The first two are a little interesting. Some people are like, I don't want to go up for 3 minutes. I'm only going if I get to go do real work, right? So there's the difference there. But less people want to go to the moon. And then I ask, if you want to go to Mars? And a lot of people sit down, including myself. I know I'm actually not built for that long of a mission. I like my cheese and my dog and my chocolate way too much to spend 3 years. So I think we have to let people who are willing to take these risks. It is hard. It is, and training for any space flight is hard. Being away from your family is hard. I mean, let's talk about Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore, who went to space thinking they were going to be there for 9 days. Okay, maybe 2 weeks. They're there for 9 months. That's a totally different mental space, and it's psychologically hard not just on them but on their families. And so, Tiffany, you are correct. It is hard. It is going to be difficult. And there's a romanticism about it, but there's also a reality about it. And I think we sometimes as a culture get caught up too much in the romanticism, and we forget it is hard. We work out 2.5 hours a day in space to keep people healthy. That's you tell people that, and that very quickly changes they're like, what? That's a lot. Like, yeah. And that only keeps us at the same baseline.
So let me transition. I'm going to interrupt I apologize on transition.
Sorry, Chris, we are just taking over.
No, this is great. No, this is great. I knew when I had you guys, I said, we need like 4 hours, but just real quick, I want to transition back to what where everybody's talking about and saying, yeah, the idea, like with any kind of risk, whether it's the military or astronaut, is not to get to zero risk. It's how do you abate, enough to the point that you can, recognizing that you only reached up at pertinent level. So I want to now transition a little bit. We've kind of touched on it, but the other big issue I think that people bring up all the time, and I'm going to combine these, but they're really separate, but I think they're linked. One is isolation. There's a lot of talk about the idea of 3 years. I mean, just imagine for discussion's sake, let's say it's a crew of 6 or a crew of 4 and a fairly small launch vehicle and you're 2.5, 3 years, you get issued not only of isolation, but I've read a lot, even questions and a lot of it's been brought up in terms of crew effectiveness, boredom, and the problems that occur with humans when they get bored. And then I'm going to slash that and say, this is not the same thing, but I think a big part of this gets back to food. And that is not just nutrition. It's not enough to say you're going to get your nutritional value every day. You've got to be able to thrive at a certain level. So I think talking about the idea of isolation, how do we abate that? I mean, how do we even think about that? And the food. And one other thing I'm going to just throw in here, just for the heck of it, a friend of mine, Greg Schmidt at NASA Ames, mentioned to me one time in an earlier webcast that they've done studies and female astronauts consume 50% less resources than males. So that's another factor. So I'll open it up.
I love that you talked about this because, Michelle, one thing I wanted to add is the mental component, which is so important. And we don't want to talk about the ugly of dying, but what about if you have a mental break? There's depression. There are so many elements that could impact your well-being in a way that physically you can't see. And of course, Michelle, we will be sending chocolates to space. So I hope that's not a hindrance. But I want to also bring it back to, yes, food is relevant, but the exploration of cooking together or preparing food together. So Sian Proctor, before she went up, we had this conversation how she really enjoyed that. But even to take a step back, when we talk about mental health, for me, the big ugly isn't just what happens when you're in space, but what happens when you come back. because I love For All Mankind, and it almost looks at the element of families and what happens to them when you return home. So with women, it's really interesting, right? Because in the past, it was the men who would go up, and then women were in charge of keeping the family together. But now when we have female missions too, it really does change the dynamic. So for me, one of my questions is, how do we conceptualize food, which is primarily something that women have taken care of historically. But when you're in space, what does that look like? And what's the interplay between mental health and well-being in space and when you return? So I think this is a question because I don't know the answers, but it's something that I think about when we look at historically the first astronauts who were just rock stars, and then what happened when they came back from that.
Let me throw one thing in before we proceed. I think I may have mentioned this before, but NASA has estimated that a crew of 4 or 5 on a 3-year mission to Mars would need 29,000 pounds of food. So let me throw that in there because, again, you get back to weight and mass. A lot of times people will contact me and go, hey, I just developed this really amazing machine that can make hamburgers from whatever. And the first question I was asking was, how much energy does it take and what's it weigh? And so you've got all these collateral things come together. And when you talk about 29,000 pounds of food, I think this plays into the whole isolation thing. We all recognize how important food is to humans historically in space and through Michelle and a lot of her astronaut colleagues who I've talked to, they mentioned some of their biggest frustrations are little things like, they can't eat anything crispy. I mean, something as simple as that because it gets into the air system thing. So I want to talk again, boredom, but also the thing is, if we're talking about that kind of food, again, there's no answer, but that, how do we deal with that kind of mass when we're talking about a crew of 4 or 5 people?
Well, I think one thing to think about is diversifying the mass. So I recently completed being part of a dietary study at Stanford, which is a whole other conversation. And listen, I will tell you, over 8 weeks, I was fine with swallowing little robots. I was fine with digging them out of my poop. I was fine with putting my poop in tubes every day for 8 weeks. I was fine with fasting for 3 days, not eating a single thing. What broke me was having to eat exactly the same food 5 days in a row. That was terrible. Not eating was better than that. So I might argue, again, send me, I'm small, I don't eat that much. But choose those 29,000 pounds really wisely, right? Because you're going to need that diversity for that health thing. And our food was very good. Our food was even fresh food that we were eating. And it was terrible, absolutely terrible, just by day 5.
Yeah, food is, the problem, station has this problem, is menu fatigue. There's a limited number of things that can be produced for the storage choices that station has. So a huge part of this problem, and not the mass problem, but the food problem, relates to storage technology and food preservation technology. That's one avenue for research that might improve things. The other avenue is regenerative technology. So the simple version of that, and it's not simple, is agriculture. But that brings a whole host of other issues, including how do you quantify it enough to assess the risk of a crop failure, essentially. And that's not even on the psychological side, is if you're growing plants and they die, that's your green thing you've been looking at. So again, it comes back, the food systems are massively important and probably underappreciated for how much they're going to affect the crew. And then the cultural side of the food system.
I'll take this too.
Let's remember one thing. Just Shaw, sorry. Just one thing. Okay. On station 2, and I know it's a big deal. I mean, the crew gets fresh food delivered every 3 or 4 months,
right?
And that's Michelle can talk to that.
Well, I'll take this to an analog we all know. We've all been sick, right? Where all you can eat is chicken noodle soup for a handful of days. And it may be the most delicious chicken noodle soup you've ever had. You're tired of it for something else. And so to Tiffany's point, 5 days of the same food, doesn't matter if Shireen is able to make the most glorious chocolate truffle if I have to eat it day in and day out. And then that becomes a psychological problem where I'm going to tell you the term hangry exists for a reason. And hangry doesn't just mean I haven't eaten. It's I haven't eaten something that brings joy to my life. So I I cannot fathom at this juncture, based on the technologies we have, how we do get around the 29,000 pound problem of food. Because at 29,000 pounds, my bet is those are bars that contain all the nutritional elements that are needed to live. If we're looking at that, what I'm saying is the 29,000 pounds that they have estimated we would need, I don't think they're estimating that includes diversity like Tiffany is talking about. My guess is that 29,000 pounds is the equivalent of protein bars day in and day out as the minimum.
So, Michelle, one of the first things we did when we started the company 5 years ago, and it was the first commercial space food companies, I consulted some amazing Michelin star restaurant chefs. One of them was Corey Lee, who started Banu, 3-star Michelin Korean chef. And one of the suggestions he had was, why not make a variety of sauces? And so I'm Desi, and we love our butter chicken and our curries. And oftentimes hacks they have at restaurants is you have the meat base or protein base or vegetables done, and you can ladle different sauces on it. But when it comes to growing something fresh, instead of just growing lettuce, grow herbs and spices. So that way you can pick and choose different variables and also mix it with a sauce base. Then for us Astrius, we had the concept of having a zero gravity sous vide. So put it all together and cook it so you have elements of variety and taste, but at the core of it, you can still take certain base protein. I think those manipulations is what makes it survivable. My kid loves pasta, so I'll do pesto pasta, red sauce pasta, macaroni and cheese pasta, and then I'll throw in some rice. But I think if we can conceptualize it as meal planning and understanding how to create taste and variety, that takes us to the next level. And thank God we're now in a world where all kinds of culinary palates are becoming acceptable, because I love French food, but in space, you don't have the ability to taste the nuances, but pungencies such as spice and menthol and ginger will really take you to that next level.
And for the first mission, right, we're not talking about the absolute perfect way that we would want to live on Mars forever, right? We're talking about keeping the crew alive and keeping them from killing each other. Well, that's a much lower bar.
Well, but I also, yeah, I agree with that. But I also think it is, there's a performance level. I mean, they've got to reach. And for 3 years, I would completely agree with you. But I think, some of you have heard me mention this before. We had a webcast a year or two ago, and one of the people on the webcast was Robert Thomas, who was a former nuclear attack sub-captain, and we talked about. They go on. We were looking for analogs because they go underwater for 3 months, and they're underwater, and it's dark and it's deep, and it's, confined space, and there may be some lessons we can learn. And when we asked him one time, once you've gone through all that, you've got your crews trained, they've been through the top training in the world, everybody's selected, you're on your mission and you're underwater. What's the most important thing in maintaining a level of high efficiency in the sub? And he said, food. And of course, they can have kitchens and chefs, but again, I'm not saying it's the same thing, but I think it's something that we need to really think about.
Well, and even just looking at the first mission, and Tiffany, I think you're absolutely right. The first mission is like get up there, get her done, and all that. However, if the answer on the first mission, which is legitimately the easiest answer, is it is a protein bar, breakfast, lunch, and dinner that contains everything that's required. I'm not saying this is a good answer. I'm saying that is the easiest answer to make sure that they're getting what they need.
So, I'm sorry, Michelle. If you need to finish, please finish. I'll raise my hand.
What I was going to say was that we can say all day long, hey, you know what? Suck it up, Buttercup. You signed up for this. You can do it. And here on Earth, they may be like, yes, so that's great. What happens in reality 6 months down the road or 3 months down the road when they're like, I literally cannot psychologically stomach another one of these.
Yep.
Fits into the boredom. Now we're having to worry about crew health issues. They don't have the stamina. They're having nutritional issues, which causes bone and muscle issues. And so there's a boredom element. There's a real health element. They're so deeply intertwined that while the hopes for beautiful food longer term is a wonderful thing to look at as our stretch goal, initial goal of how do we do it for the first mission that is it is probably not going to be incredibly enjoyable, but it has to be enjoyable enough for people to be willing to eat enough to stay healthy.
Yeah, that's another one. We live in nutrition. We know that. Go ahead.
And that's where I was going to jump in, is that we need to understand what the lower limit of, again, I'll just use the phrase, the menu variability. We know what's available on station, and it's not quite large enough. And that's a fairly cushy mission compared to what we're talking about. So there is a certain amount of dietary variation, and there's a long history. If I remember correctly, every crew on the Gemini missions, especially extended duration missions, lost weight. And they weren't exercising on those missions. They were just sitting there and choosing not to eat because they couldn't eat after a week and a half of the food that was provided. So even if a crew says that this is going to be fine, we'll be able to do it, it doesn't happen that way. And there's plenty of experience with that. The biggest issue with the food, and it's the same issue with the medical and with several of the other subsystems, is having a mission planner who spent his entire lifetime on the technical or on the technical aspects of the mission, appreciate the impact that needs to be made for the crew. That's one of the toughest things to do early on, is to actually have the human factors planning really be appreciated in the mission design.
I think pleasure and performance is such an important pairing. And Michelle, when you say joy, to me, that is so strongly correlated with my ability to do the job that's set in front of me. Because if there's no joy, after a while, my motivation is going to go downhill. And so, sure, something can be high performance, but if I don't derive pleasure from that, a year later, forget about it. I'm out.
And I think that something NASA doesn't openly talk about. And as we have these conversations. That's why I love having these conversations. I'm not sure my NASA colleagues love me being quite so blunt all the time. We act like astronauts don't have problems in space. We act like they're happy with the food and that they don't go through bouts of depression. We act like all is great, fine, fabulous, and wonderful. And the reality is they're human, and humans have challenges. And NASA wants everyone to look like this hero and amazing person. And so they hide all of that. And we don't talk about those things. And so from the public eye, I don't think the average person would think about the impact that food has, because they don't realize it's already a problem with the people we have flying in space. So I think real honest conversations about psychological well-being is something that really needs to be more in the public eye in all space flight.
We just have a few minutes left. And as I knew with this crew, I got to like 1/3 of the things I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding, which is why I selected all. I said, this is going to be easy. I don't have to do much at all for this one. And I was right. So but again, I think the other thing is it may take some really out of the box thinking and some big ideas that we haven't imagined yet. I know when we were talking, Robert Thomas and the Navy people, they talked about, in wartime, they saw this by supply ships. And I know there's all sorts of issues and problems there as well, but I do think it's going to take some really, really different kinds of thinking for us to deal with this. The one thing we haven't gotten to, which is another big issue, and that is the cost. We talk about commercial versus government. That's a whole nother conversation. We don't really have time to get into that. But the cost of this and who's going to pay for it, and is there a commercial play in this, or et cetera, is something that's really really important too. It is along with a lot of other issues. Final thoughts from each of you. Let me start with Shireen.
Yes. So this is also a response to a question from Naomi. What about a hybrid between energy bars and diverse diet? Astrius's mission is to create the most pleasurable food that thinks beyond what's already there. So I look forward to carrying that conversation forward. That's my thought. Look beyond.
Okay. Mike?
Well, first, a question for Shireen, and you can answer this offline. But I know one of the toughest things for a simple thing was creating savory bars. So I want to hear how you guys are attacking that. Everybody's used to sweet kind of breakfast bars. I mean, again, I really come back to being a product of my previous environment, really having the human factors appreciated, starting from the initial mission design, is going to be one of the hardest cultural changes we got to make make this kind of mission possible. And, on top of that is kind of resetting our perception of risk tolerance as a society. We've been incredibly lucky in our spaceflight experience relative to the near misses we've had. And so it's a big conversation to have out loud.
Michelle?
There's a reason we want to send humans and not just robots. It's the humanity of it. And it is also what makes it the most difficult element is we humans aren't robots. And so while the mechanics and the engineering are difficult, and even the governmental challenges of regulations are difficult, solving how to let humans be humans is how we will excel in it. And it is not an easy answer. There is no, the thing I love about things like this conversation is there is no black and white, there is no answer. It's more of a, I don't know, how do we go down this road and keep going down a road that is a good path. And so I look forward to seeing how we can keep the human in human spaceflight.
Yeah, and Michelle and I have talked about this a lot, as well as other people. There's a whole ethical issue that gets into these kinds of conversations too. Tiffany.
My not so secret wish is to never again have to answer the question, why should we spend money on space when we have so many problems here on Earth? I would like to invite everyone on this call to think about how the advances that we are pursuing in order to put humans on Mars will also make life on Earth better, and vice versa. If you are excited about this, please reach out to me, because this is the way we build the future of humanity together, no matter where we call home.
Okay, thank you all so much. We are out of time. I want to thank our sponsors one more time. Space 629, KSTC, National Science Stem Cell Foundation, SART Program, Media Collaboratory here in Lexington, Space Tango, Baird Financial Services, the Survey Program at NASA Ames, headed by Greg Schmidt, the Shelgren Center at UK, Higher Orbits Interstellar Foundation, Visit Lexington 22 Solutions. Thank you all so much. And just to remind you, in about a week or so, this will be online. All of our webcasts are posted online. You can go to our YouTube page and look at this one in a week or so, as well as any of the rest that we've had. Thank the panel so much. This has been great. Maybe we should do another one of these. There's still some other areas we haven't solved yet, so we'll talk offline about that. So thank you very much, Chris Kimball, Humanity in Deep Space. Visit our website. Thank you for tuning in.
Our continued exploration of space is accompanied by profound questions, responsibilities, and obligations. What is our place and ultimate responsibility to the larger universe? And how do we maintain a sense of humanity as we leave the planet Earth? These questions and more are discussed in our videos, as well as other curated content at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space. The music for this episode was written and performed by Danny Grandstaff and is available at dannygrandstaff.bandcamp.com.